Okay, now we are off to our second project in this tutorial, and this one is going to be a temperature converter, and basically it's going to be similar to the second project that we did, which was a BMI calculator, but this time we're going to be changing temperature from Fahrenheit to degrees Celsius, right? So as you can see, once again we have our node modules, we have our package.json, package log.json, and that is just to run our dependencies, things like express, node.mon, all of that, right? The things we need to use node.js and the backend and our runtime. So I'm going to first start by explaining the HTML, right? As you can see right here, we have our tailwind for the styling. We have our body here, and inside our body we have a div that is the class of container. Inside of that we have another div, right, that's basically just going to create a border. So what's this creating is something that's sort of like a card. That's where our converter is going to be located on our web page, and then we're going to have our heading here, which is going to say temperature converter, to tell us what this app does, right? And then the first thing we have here is a form. As you can see, we have a form tag here, and our form has 4 HTMX attributes. The first one is trigger. So this just tells us when the actual processing will be happening, right? Where it's basically like an event handler. So on submit, that's going to be our trigger. That's what's going to trigger everything, right? And what is going to be triggered? It's a post request, as you can see with the hx post attribute. It's a post request to this route here /convert, right? And then the target, so anything that's any processes that are done are going to, any changes that are made as a result of that, the responses that we get are going to be targeted to the element that has the ID of result. And if we look at our page, where is that one? It's this div right here. As you can see, once again it's an empty div, as you can see. So that's where the changes will be made, and then once again we're going to have an hx indicator on the element that has the ID of loading. As you can see, it's this span right here, and once again we have that loading gif. So it's basically going to look the same as far as the loading indicator is concerned. And yes, after that, we basically, inside of our form, we have this label right here, right? And the label is for the Fahrenheit. That's basically going to tell you, the user, where to input the value in Fahrenheit so it can be converted to degrees Celsius, right? And the first input that we have here is of type number. It has the ID of Fahrenheit, the name is Fahrenheit, and then this is just the class for tailwind styling. The value is 32, so that's going to be the default value that the input is going to have. So as soon as you open it, it will already have 32, and you can convert 32 to degrees Celsius, and it's required. You can't continue using everything. You can't click on the convert button. It won't work unless you give this a value. So it does have a default value of 32 though, but it can be changed. And then we have a button here. The button is a submit button, and this is a class for our HTMX styling. So now we're going to move on to our JavaScript, right, the back end. So it's very simple this time. We can ignore this. It's very simple this time. We have our post handler here, right? As you can see, it's app.post, and once again, if you don't know what app is just express, right? It's this express method here, or this express function. We just put it in a variable called app, and we're saying that once you get a post request to the convert route, which is what we are sending from the HTML, right, using HTMX, we're going to run this anonymous function here, which takes a request and a response as parameters. And inside of that function we have a set timeout once again, and inside of this set timeout we are running another anonymous function, right? And inside of that function we're going to create a variable called Fahrenheit, where we are going to take the, so in our request, right, we're going to go into the body of it and take the element that is Fahrenheit, right? So the thing that is Fahrenheit, and if you remember in our index.html, Fahrenheit is the input that we give here, right? So it's going to take the input that the user gives, and it's going to pass it into a float, because remember, when you put something as an input in a HTML input field, it's treated as a string. So we're going to pass it, change it to, so that it can be treated as a float, right? And then we're going to create a variable called Celsius, and then in our variable called Celsius we are basically going to run this function right here, this formula right here to convert it to Celsius. This is how you do it. We first take the value that we have, we subtract 32 from it, then we multiply by 5 divided by 9. That's how we convert from Fahrenheit to um, what do you call this, Celsius, right? And then after that, we're going to use the .send method to send our response, the response that we get from all of this. And as you can see, once again, it is an HTML tags, right? It's just HTML code. We have a paragraph tag, and inside of that paragraph tag, we take our Fahrenheit variable, right, which is this one, the answer we got here, the thing that has been inputted by the user into the input box, right? And we put it here. We're going to say this value Fahrenheit degree, this value degrees Fahrenheit is equal to whatever we get as a result of running this calculation here, and we fix it to 2 decimal places, otherwise it can be very long. We fix it to 2 decimal places, and we say degrees Celsius, right? And this is a paragraph tag that's going to appear in our HX target. If you remember, our HX target is the element with the ID of result, so it's going to appear under the button. So if I just go to my browser and I just refresh, as you can see, this is what we have. This is the input box, the label and everything. As I said, 32 will be the default value. When we click convert, it loads, right? And then it tells us 32 degrees Fahrenheit is equals to 0 degrees Celsius, right? So now I'm just gonna ask Vhukudo, which value do you want us to convert now? We're gonna change it from 32.
Let's do, I want us to go to negatives. Let's do 10.
Okay, so negative 10.
No, let's put actual 10. So I want the results to go to negative
Okay.
degrees Celsius.
Okay, so we say 10
Yes.
Fahrenheit, we click on convert, and as you can see, it's,
It's a cold day, ne?
yeah, it's cold, it's cold.
Minus 12. I
Yeah,
don't think, does it get to minus 12 in real world? Uh,
I think in
no.
other countries, not in South Africa.
In other countries, in South Africa, it doesn't.
Yeah,
Okay. No, everything is fine.
yeah, so that is it for our temperature converter. Okay, now we are moving on to the next app, right? The next project, and this one is going to be relatively simple one. It's going to be a weather display. Basically, it's just going to be weather polling, right? And the HTML is very simple. We just have a body, and then our body just has not HTMX. Our body has tailwind styling. It's just to make the background look nice, give it some color. And then we're gonna have a div here, and then in our div we're gonna have a heading, and it's gonna say weather in Johannesburg, and then it's going to have a paragraph here, and the paragraph will first start loading. So as you can see here, we have inside of a paragraph we have our span tag, and inside of the span tag we have our HTMX attributes, right? And the first one is hxget. As we've explained already, hxget just sends a get response to this endpoint here, to this root here, right? And in this case it's now get temperature. And then we have our hx trigger. Hx trigger is like an event handler, right? It's basically like an event, and it's basically telling us when does everything happen, right? And in this case is a time-based event, right? It's a time-based trigger. Everything will happen every 5 seconds, right? So it's first gonna show loading, and then after 5 seconds it's going to trigger the get response, and then our back-end code is going to run. So in terms of our back-end, as you can see, the first thing that we do is we create a variable called counter. We create a counter variable, and it starts off at 0, right? And then after that we're going to handle our get request for the polling example, right? And we have our get request handler here. We have dot get, and we have the method called poll, as you can see. And it's different to what we have here with get temperature, but I'll just explain this in a few minutes. And then here we are running a function, and an anonymous function that takes request and response as parameters, and inside of it we increment the counter variable, right? After incrementing the counter variable, we create a variable called data, and data is just an object that has a value property, and the value is the counter. The value of the value property is the counter, and then we take the data and we just convert it into JSON, as you can see here, right? We have converted into JSON, and then outside of the outside of handling the get request, right, we create another variable called current temperature. So that's going to be our starting point, right? It's going to be 20 degrees. In this case, it's going to be displayed as degrees, and that's going to be the temperature we start off with. And then now we're going to handle our get request for the weather, and that's when we start working with the get request that we sent here to this route, the get temperature route. As you can see, we have the get temperature route here, and then we're going to run a function that takes a request and a response as parameters. Again, we're going to take current temperature and we're going to concatenate this with basically the changes. Remember, there's going to be changes. Our HX trigger is going to change something every 5 seconds, and these changes are going to happen randomly. We're just going to generate a random number, and we're going to add that to our current temperature, right? Sorry, I said concatenate, not concatenate. We're going to add it to our current temperature just to create a random temperature change. And then after doing all of that, we're going to send our response. We're going to use the .send method to send our response, which is the random temperature. That's basically, we have 20 as our starting point, and then we add a random number, and then the result of all of that, we send it back to our HTML and we fix it to 1 decimal point, and then we concatenate degrees Celsius, right, to represent it as a temperature. And then every 5 seconds a random number is added to 20, and then we have a new temperature, and we send that, and it's gonna display, and that just keeps happening over and over again. So if I go to my browser, I refresh to get rid of this. As you can see, that's what we have. It says weather in Johannesburg. It loads for about 5 seconds. It shows us 20.6. It waits another 5 seconds, and then it's gonna change again. Now it's 20.1. It's gonna load another 5 seconds, and every 5 seconds it's just generating a random number and it's adding it to 20 to give us a random temperature, right?
Yeah.
Yes, so that is the third project. Okay, now we are moving on to our fourth project, which is a contact search widget. This is the HTML for this one is a bit more complicated, but I'll explain it. As you can see, inside of our body, most of this is just for styling, right? But we have a span here inside of this div with the class of container. We have this span here, which, as you can see, is going to be running the it has the class of HTMX indicator, and that gives us a hint that it's going to be basically running our HTMX indicator. That means there's an HX indicator attribute that applies to it, but we'll explain that. As you can see, there's the ID of loading, and it's just it's that loading div once more. And then outside of that, we have another div, right? And inside of this div, we have a heading, which is going to say search contact, and we have an input, right? And then inside of our input, we have a few attributes, right? The first is a class, just to apply the styling. It's the input box is of type search. The name that we give it is search, and then it has a placeholder, which is begin typing to search users, right? That's what the user's gonna see inside of the input box, just to let them know what's supposed to happen. And then we have an HX post attribute to send a post request to this route here, which is /search/API. And then, as you can see here, we have an HX trigger attribute, right? As we've explained already, this is more like an event handler, right? And the event in this input is the input, and the event in this case is the trigger in this case is the input changed, right? And then we're gonna delay by 500 milliseconds, and then we're going to apply it on search, right? And then the target is the element with the ID of our search results. And then, as I've indicated, as I've alluded to already, we're going to apply the HX indicator to the element with the ID of loading, which we've already explained above here, right? And then underneath all of that, we're going to have a table, right? And then in our table, as you can see, we're going to have the name as the table head. So the heading at the top, it will have name and email, and then the body initially is going to be empty, and that is where our search results will go, right? After we send the post request and get a response, it's going to populate this. If you remember, The HX target is the element with the ID of search results, and as you can see here, the ID is search results. That's where everything is going to go, right, when we get our results. And then I go to our backend, the server.js. As you can see here, we have a list of contacts here. We have an array that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 objects, and each object has a name property, right? The name for this one is John Doe, as you can see, and it has an email property, and the value for that on this, the first one is john@example.com, and they all, it's different names and different emails, but they all take the same formats, right? And then now we have some code right here to handle the post request for searching our contacts. As you can see right here, we have app.post, and then inside we have this root here, which is a /search, and then we run a function which takes a parameter called request and another one which is response, and inside of that function we create a variable called search term, and we go, so in terms of our request, wherever the request was sent, we go into the body of that and we look for the element which with the name of search, and then if you go to our HTML, you will see that this element is this input box here, right? It's this input box here, right? And then I just go back to our server.js. We just convert that to lowercase, right? Basically to make the input that the user puts case insensitive. So it doesn't matter if you put it in all caps or whatever, it's going to be converted to lowercase at the end of the day. Then we have we have our if statement here, which just checks the search term if it's null or not, right? So if our search term is null or if it evaluates to false, that means we either have an invalid input or we have nothing in the input box. And if that's the case, we just return an empty table row, right? So if you remember here, our table body has nothing, right? It's waiting for our results, right? And then if the input box has nothing, like a user adds nothing and then they click the button to search, it's just going to return an empty table row, and the table is just going to be empty. There's nothing that's going to be inside the table body, right? And then we're going to create a variable called search results, and then search results will basically take contacts. It's going to take contacts and it's going to filter them and run this function here where contacts is an array, and then in this array we're going to go through each element of the array, and for each element we're going to create a variable called name, and we're just gonna take that name and change it to lowercase once again to make it case insensitive, and then we're gonna take the email and we're gonna make it case insensitive. If you remember, contact is this array that we created here, this array of objects, right? And we're gonna filter through each object, and for each object we're just going to create these two variables here, but converting the values to lowercase, right? And then we're going to return if the name that we have includes the search term. So whatever the user puts into the input box is going to be our search term, and if this search term is included in any of these values here, we're going to return it. Or if the search term includes anything that is in these email values here, we are going to return it. So that's just what that line of code does. And then after all of that, we are going to have a set timeout function, which is going to run an anonymous function inside of it. We create a variable called search results HTML, which is going to be equal to search results, right? And inside of that, we're going to map our search results, right? And we're going to run this function here, right, for each element that's part of our search results, right? Remember, search results is this variable here, and it's going to be an array because we're filtering through an array of objects, right? And then for each element of that array, we are going to look at the contact, right? And then we are going to apply this HTML to it, right? Just adding using formatted strings, adding this variable here, and just basically just showing the whatever we found here, whatever we returned here, we're just gonna show it as a we're just gonna show the name as part of a table, right? It's going to be inside of a table cell, right? So we're going to show both the name and the email in the table cell, and this is going to populate our body here, right? And it's going to fill out our table body, right? And that's going to be the row that we generate, right? And since, like I said, this is an array, we're going to use .join to convert it into a string, right? And then after doing all of that, we're going to send search results HTML, what I just explained here, this HTML right here, which is applying for each result that is returned as a result of running this function right here. We're going to send it back to our HTML. We're going to send it back to this table body here, right? And then after sending it back, as you can see, this is a set timeout. We wait 1 second, 1000 milliseconds, and then we're going to send it back, and all the results are going to be there. And if there are no results, or if the input box is empty, we're just gonna send an empty table row. And then now we're going to be dealing with handling the post request for contact search from a JSON placeholder. So this is just to go with the example that we had here, but the actual code that we'll be running when we click the button is, as you can remember, the route that we provided here. Let me just look for it. The route that we provided here with our post request is /search/API, right? So that's what we're going to be running, and as part of handling that post request, as you can see, this is the route here, /search/API. We are going to use the async keyword, right, to run as an asynchronous function which takes request and response as parameters once again, and we're just going to do the same exact thing we saw here, but instead of using this array, we are going to be using the response from the API, right? If search term is non-existent, or it's not what we like, or you understand, we just it evaluates to false, we return an empty table, an empty table row, and then we create a variable called, we create two variables, response and contact. Response is just using the await keyword to fetch a response from the API of users, right? And then we take contact and we take that response and we pass it into JSON, right? And then we run our search results function the same way we did above. For every, we convert it to lowercase to make it case insensitive, and then for every contact that is in our search API, if it matches the name put into the search box, right? If the search term is included in the API, we return that name and the email, and then we represent that in terms of table cells. As you can see, we have a table row that has two table cells, one containing the name of the contact that is found in the search and the email of the contact that is found in the search. And because it is an array, we use .join to convert it into a string, and then we send that to our empty table body, which has the ID. If you remember, here it is the ID of search results. And yes, we just send that this variable is stored in a variable called search results HTML. We send that to our page, and we wait 1 second for that. So I know that was a mouthful. Let's see what that looks like on our browser. I'm just gonna refresh. As you can see, we have this card right here, this box right here, and this is the search box that I was that I was talking about. And then I'm just gonna search the letter L. Doesn't matter if it's lowercase or uppercase. It's going to query the API, and then it's going to run that function, the search results HTML function, and then it's going to represent as a table cell. As you can see, this is a table row. It's the name and the email, right, of the first thing in that API that we got that matches the search result that the search input, the search query that I gave here, and it's just showing everything else that matches. As you can see, it shows it as a table row, which is basically what we defined here, just giving it the name and the email, right? So that is all for project 4, and we'll now be moving to project 5. Okay, now we are on to our 5th project, which is a form validation, email validation, right? As you can see in our HTML, we have a form here, and inside of our form we have a heading, and we have an input box for the email address, and inside our input box, our input tag has the HTMX attributes of hx post, which is sending a post request to the /contact/email root, and as you can see, it has a class, a type, and an ID, and it is required, right? And then we have a secondary div. We have another div outside of that, which is a label for the first name, and that is also an input with a type, name, class, ID, and it's also required. And then we have a div which has a label for the last name, right, and an input which is the same as the other one, just this time it's last name and not first name. And then after all of that, we have a button, right? And in our button, inside of it, it says submit, right? So that is it for HTML. On the backend server, on our server.js, what we do have is this code right here to handle the post request for the email validation. As you can see, this is the endpoint that we are working with, /contact/email. We're going to run our function which takes request and response as parameters, right? And basically, the first thing that we do is create a variable that takes the email, right? Basically what we gave as an email in our input box, right? And this is the email regex that basically just matches this. It checks if it matches this, right? So this is just the format that we want our email to take. And then we have is valid right here, as you can see. And then is valid is just an object that has the message property, says this email is valid, and then it gives it a text styling, a tailwind styling, right? And then we have another object for handling if it's invalid, right? And then we have an if statement, and if our if statement is basically saying that the submitted email, the email that is put into our input box, right, if it doesn't match, when we use the test method, if it doesn't match this regex here, this is the code that runs, right? We use the send method to return a response, which is this HTML, as you can see here, this HTML code. And basically what this does is exactly the HTML that we have, or initially the HTML that we have originally. It's just that we now have a value, right, which will be pre-populated, which is the email that you gave. It's not going to disappear, but underneath it we're going to create a div, right? And this div is just going to apply this is invalid object, right? And it's going to say please enter a valid email address, and it's going to apply the proper styling, right? So it's going to give it this class right here, which is for the styling, and it's going to display this message right here, as you can see. And then that's if the email, the input given, does not match with the reject. If it does, as we hear, we'll move on to our else statement. It's going to return, it's going to use the send method to return a response to our HTML, and is returning just HTML code, as you can see. And the HTML that we have here is exactly the same as the one that we originally had. It's just that now whatever input that you gave will still be there, right? We're going to populate that value, right? It's still going to be there. And the difference now again is that we're going to have a div underneath the input box, which will have the styling of the is valid variable. As you can see here, this object here will have this styling, which is going to be green. If it's invalid, it's going to be red. If it's valid, it's going to be green. And then it's going to give you the message here, which is that email is valid, as you can see. And that is all, basically. It's that simple. And then if you go to our browser and I just refresh, as you can see, we have this email form here, right? I give it an email. Let me give it a incorrect email. Let me just say, because we know that this does not match our email regex, right? As you can see, this does not match. As I try to move on, do you see it says please enter a valid email address in a red text, right? It doesn't allow us to do this, right? But then I can change it and make it valid. As you see, when I make it valid, it says that email is valid. And that is our project 5 email validation. Okay, so now we will be moving on to our last project, right, which is a profile editor. So in this project, as you can see, our HTML is very simple. We just have a div here, which is of class container, and this div, as you can see, this is our target. It says hx target this. That means this div itself is our target. Whatever process is going to happen, whatever changes are going to happen, are going to apply to this div. So basically everything here is going to change, which is basically all of our HTML. We're going to change everything that we have. And then inside of that div, right, oh sorry, we have another HTMX attribute, which is hx swap. So what this means is that we are going to swap our HTML, and the value that it has is outer HTML. Outer HTML just basically means everything including the tag. So we're going to swap everything including the tag. So we can change this from a div to make it not a div, or we can make it a different div. We can just swap the entire thing, right? And then inside of that div with those HTMX attributes, we have another div, right? In the inside of that div, we have a heading, right, which just says profile. This is a profile editor. We have a div that says a heading that says profile. We have another heading that is the name of the person, the profile of the name of the person whose profile it is, and it has some lorem ipsum here just to act as a placeholder for the bio. And then we have that's all in a paragraph tag, right? And then underneath all of that we have a button, right? And in this button we have hx get attribute, which we know sends a get response to our back end. We have slash profile slash one slash edit, that is going to be the endpoint, the root, right? And inside is going to say click to edit, right? So going to our server.js is a bit more complicated, but not really complicated. What we first have is that we have some code to handle the get request for the profile edit. As you can see, this is the endpoint that we provided in our HTML, right? The only difference is that instead of giving it an actual ID, we have a placeholder for the ID so that it can apply to many different profiles. It's just that in this case we only have one. And as you can see, it's app.get. We have the endpoint. We run a function that takes request and response as parameters. As you can see, we send the response as soon as we click the button, the click to edit button, right? It's going to basically send this as a response. It's going to swap the outer HTML. If you remember, we had hx swap attribute here. So that's the condition that's going to swap that outer HTML. So that div will be replaced with this, right? With this div right here, which is similar to that div, but this time it's basically the first div we had inside of that is it's going to have the same attributes, right? So this div that we are swapping with is also swappable the same way that the first div is swappable. And then inside of that div we have a form. As you can see, the form is basically just it's going to have an hx put attribute, which means that we can update the info that we have on there. And then it's just going to be the same card that we had initially, right? And then it's going to have a name and an input. And as you can see, as part of this, the name is John Doe. So I took some shortcuts here to make some changes. The changes are already made in our code, right? So if you see, the name is still John Doe, right? But then the bio is no longer just some lorem ipsum now. The bio is now a text area, and the text area is just this text here that I provided, right? To take a shortcut, I wanted to change the bio, but I didn't want to change it. It's going to take long to actually like type it, so I just provided it as our code. So when we click to edit, it's just going to be there anyway. And it's going to have two buttons this time. The first button will become a button of type submit that's going to have save changes, and that's going to basically run our hx put request, and that's going to update, right? Whatever we provided this time, that's going to replace what we had originally, right? But we're going to go back to our initial page, what we had initially, right? We're going to leave this edit page and go back to the display page that we had initially. It also has a cancel button which cancels the whole process, right? And then now we have the code to handle our put request for editing, because remember, the second div that we create has the hx put attribute, right, which is for updating, right? And it sends a put request, and this is the code that's going to handle that put request. As you can see, it's the same endpoint that we provided here. It's just that instead of an ID, it has a placeholder. As you can see right here, this is what we provided. It says slash profile slash one. Here it says slash profile slash ID. This ID is just a placeholder for that one. We run a formula, we run a function which takes request and response as parameters. We create a name and bio attributes, and then we run the xss function here just to sanitize our info, right? It's for like security purposes. And then we have a request going to our whatever sent the request, we're going to the body, and we take the name inside of that body, right? And then we take the bio, right? And then we save those into these variables that we have here, and then we send a response, right? We use the .send method to send a response, right, which is going to be a div that is similar to the div that we had originally. And instead, this time, instead of having what we originally had, we are going to take those changes that we gave here and we are going to plug them into the spots. So as you can see here, if we just compare the two, in terms of our first heading, right, instead, if you remember, at first in our heading we had this name here, John Doe. Instead of John Doe, now we're just going to have this variable here, and this variable is going to contain whatever you gave here in terms of the edit form, right? And then in the bio, instead of having this lorem ipsum that we initially had, right, instead of having this, we are going to have whatever is in the bio variable, which is whatever you gave in the edit form, right? And then we're going to have a button here which is going to say click to edit, which will take you back here, and it's just going to run the same thing over and over again to help you be able to edit that. So if I run this, so let me just refresh. Okay, so to run this I have to go back to VS Code, and I just have to go back to the right directory. So just gonna do this, gonna use npm run dev command, and then this is going to start our server. Yes, our server is now running and it's listening on port 3000, as you can see. So if I refresh, we should get the profile. As you can see, it says John Doe, and then it has this as the bio. We press this click to edit button, and it comes here. As you can see, like I said, I took a shortcut, already changed the bio in the code, so I'm not gonna change it again. I'm just gonna change this from John Doe, and I'm gonna give it my name, right? And then I give it my name, I click on save changes, and as you can see, it's no longer saying John Doe whatever. It's now giving you my name and the bio that I provided. And yes, that is all from HTMX. My name was Lucky, and was the driver, and Vhukudo was my navigator. Thank you.
Thank you.